In the autumn of 1841, a letter arrived at Bellewood Plantation in the low country of South Carolina, written in the careful hand of Reverend Silas Cormorant, director of the Black Hollow Foundling Home. It contained a proposal that Nathaniel Bellewood would accept within the hour, and it would condemn 41 children to a fate that would not be uncovered for 18 months, until the night the fields caught fire and the earth beneath the old carriage house split open like a wound. The children were orphans, white mostly, born to fever, to childbirth, to the kind of poverty that starved mothers before their milk came in. The church called them foundlings, the state called them wards. Reverend Cormorant called them raw material. He had been looking for a place where no one asked questions. Bellewood Plantation, isolated by marsh and oak and the twin curses of ambition and shame, was perfect. Nathaniel Bellewood was a man of modest means trying to live like a man of empire. His 200 acres produced mediocre cotton. His name appeared on no important registers, but he possessed something the Reverend needed. Distance from Charleston, a crumbling outbuilding no one had entered in years, and a daughter whose existence had become a problem he could not solve. Her name was Constance. She was 23 years old and had not been seen by anyone outside the family since she was 16. They said she was unwell. They said her mind had turned. They said she had been sent to relatives in Virginia, or perhaps she had died, or perhaps she had never existed at all. But in the servants' quarters, where 40 men, women, and children lived in quarters not fit for livestock, they knew better. They had heard her screaming. Among those who heard was a man named Ezra. I am 34 years old. Hands scarred from field work, but trained in secret by his mother, who had been a root doctor before the overseer broke her back with a wagon tongue for conjuring. Ezra knew plants, he knew bones. He knew how to pull fever from a child's body and how to hear the truth beneath a lie. And when the orphans arrived in carts covered with canvas, pale and hollow-eyed and silent as stones, Ezra knew immediately that something had been done to them, something that required forgetting. But what do you do when the children cannot remember their own names? When the man who owns the land also owns your body? When the church and the law and the very soil you stand on all speak the same language of obedience? What do you do when you realize the screaming woman locked in the attic and the silent children locked in the carriage house are pieces of the same sin? And what do you do when you learn that both of them are bait for something far worse? Before we go further, understand this. What you're about to hear is not legend. It is not an exaggeration. The records were burned, but the witnesses were real. The scars were real. If you've come here looking for easy answers or comfortable history, you've come to the wrong place. But if you want the truth, the kind that sits heavy in your chest long after the video ends, then stay. Subscribe, turn on notifications. And when this is over, tell me in the comments, would you have stayed silent or would you have opened the door? Let's go back. The air in the South Carolina low country does not move in autumn. It hangs. It presses against skin like wet wool. It carries the smell of pluff mud and rotting oak leaves and the sour-sweet tang of indigo fields left too long in the sun. Mosquitoes rise in veils at dusk. The sound of cicadas is so constant it becomes a kind of silence. Bellewood Plantation sat 17 miles west of Charleston, accessible only by a single rutted road that flooded with every hard rain. The main house was Georgian in ambition, but colonial in execution. 2 stories of whitewashed wood, a sagging portico held up by columns that had begun to lean, and windows that no longer closed flush against their frames. The paint was always peeling. The garden was always overgrown. Nathaniel Bellewood told visitors it was the climate. The truth was that he could not afford to maintain it. He had inherited the land from his father, who had inherited it from a grandfather who bought it cheap after the Revolution. In those days, men could make fortunes on rice and indigo. But Nathaniel had been born a generation too late, with soil already exhausted and debts already accumulating. He grew cotton because everyone grew cotton. He sold it for slightly less than it cost to produce. He borrowed money from Charleston factors and paid it back at interest rates that made him wake in the night with his jaw clenched so tight his teeth cracked. His wife had died in 1835, giving birth to a son who lived only 3 days. That left Constance, his only surviving child, the one piece of fortune he thought he could convert into security. She had been beautiful once. Dark-haired, small-waisted, with a kind of pale, fine-boned face that appeared in daguerreotypes like something from a poem. Nathaniel had planned to marry her to a man of property, someone from one of the old Charleston families, someone who could erase Bellewood's debts with a signature. But at 16, Constance had begun to refuse food, not from vanity, from conviction. She said the meat was screaming. She said she could hear voices in the walls. She said that God had spoken to her in a dream and told her that all flesh was corrupt, that the only purity was hunger, that her body was a temple that must be hollowed out to make room for grace. Nathaniel called for doctors. The first one bled her and prescribed laudanum. The second one suggested marriage and childbirth to correct the womb's influence on the mind. The third one, a man named Dr. Amos Grier, arrived from Charleston with a leather case full of instruments and a letter of introduction from a private society Nathaniel had never heard of. He called it the Ordo Renovo, the Order of Renewal. Dr. Grier examined Constance in private. When he emerged 2 hours later, he informed Nathaniel that his daughter was suffering from spiritual obstruction, a condition in which the soul's natural appetite for life had been reversed by melancholic vapors. The treatment, he said, was strict. It involved seclusion, controlled feeding, ice baths, and a regimen of medicines designed to reset the humors. It also involved restraint. Nathaniel, desperate and ashamed, agreed. Constance was moved to the attic. The windows were nailed shut. A lock was installed on the outside of the door. For 7 years she lived there. The house servants brought her meals. They emptied her chamber pot. They did not speak to her, because Dr. Grier had said that conversation would overstimulate her fragile mind. No one knew what the doctor did during his twice-monthly visits. But Ezra, who sometimes carried firewood to the back kitchen, had seen the instruments. Tongue depressors fitted with screws, leather cuffs lined with steel, glass vials filled with liquids that smelled like turpentine and rotted flowers. And once, through a crack in the attic floor, he had seen Constance's wrists. They were black with bruises shaped like fingers. Nathaniel Bellewood had been raised to believe that the world was a ladder, and that a man's worth was measured by how high he climbed. His father had told him, "We are not like them. We are not laborers. We do not break our backs. We command. We accumulate. We ascend." But Nathaniel had learned young that commanding required capital, and capital required either inheritance or cruelty. He had little of the first, so he practiced the second. He did not beat his slaves more than other men. He did not starve them or work them to death, at least not intentionally. But he sold children away from their mothers when the factor in Charleston offered a good price. He looked away when the overseer, a man named Tobias Rudge, took women into the barn and came out alone, buttoning his trousers. Nathaniel told himself he was pragmatic. He told himself that sentiment was a luxury of the wealthy. And when his daughter's mind broke, he told himself that locking her away was a kindness, because a mad daughter was worse than no daughter at all. What he did not tell himself, because he could not bear it, was that Constance had started refusing food the week after Tobias Rudge smiled at her across the dinner table and Nathaniel had laughed and said, "She'll make someone a fine wife, won't she, Tobias?" Constance Bellewood remembered everything. She remembered the night her father invited the overseer to dine with them as if he were an equal. She remembered the way Rudge had looked at her, not with desire but with appraisal. The way you look at a horse you intend to break. She remembered her father's laugh. And she understood with the clarity that only a 16-year-old girl trapped in a house full of men can understand, that her body was not hers, that it had never been hers, that it was currency and her father was calculating exchange rates. So she stopped eating. If her body was all she had, then she would take it back the only way she knew how. She would make herself useless. The doctors came. They pried open her mouth and poured broth down her throat. They wrapped her in wet sheets and locked her in rooms where the temperature dropped until her lips turned blue. They told her she was sick. They told her she was selfish. They told her that her immortal soul was in danger. Dr. Grier told her something worse. He told her that suffering was holy, that the body was a temple that had to be purified through pain, that if she submitted, if she let him do what needed to be done, she would be remade into something clean. He had said the same thing to the children. Ezra's mother had been named Abigail. She had died when he was 12. Her spine snapped in 2 places after Tobias. Rudge caught her preparing a charm for a pregnant girl who wanted to lose the overseer's baby before it was born. Rudge had called it witchcraft. Nathaniel Bellewood had called it destruction of property. Abigail had called it mercy. Before she died, she taught Ezra everything she knew: how to mix poultices from slippery elm and tobacco, how to read a fever by the color of the tongue, how to pull splinters of bone from a wound without tearing the flesh further. And she taught him the one thing that kept him alive through the 22 years that followed her death: they fear what they don't understand. So let them fear you just enough to leave you alone. Ezra became the man people came to when the white doctor wouldn't come, when a child's cough turned to pneumonia, when infection set into a wound, when a woman bled too long after childbirth. He saved lives, and in doing so he made himself indispensable. Nathaniel Bellewood did not like him, but he did not sell him either. That was as close to freedom as Ezra would ever come, until the night he saw the children arrive. The carts came just after sunset on October 14th, 1841. 3 of them pulled by mules covered in canvas that had been stitched tight so that nothing inside could be seen. Reverend Sila's cormorant rode in front, tall and thin as a heron, his black coat buttoned to the throat despite the heat. He wore spectacles with dark green lenses. Even in the fading light, no one could see his eyes. Nathaniel Bellewood met him at the front of the house. They shook hands. They spoke in voices too low to hear. Then the Reverend gestured to the carts and the canvas was pulled back. Inside were children. 41 of them ages 4 to 13, pale, silent, staring at nothing. Their clothes were clean but identical rough cotton smocks, gray as ash. Their hair had been cut short, boys and girls alike. Their hands were folded in their laps. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them moved. Ezra, watching from the shadow of the kitchen house, felt his stomach turn. He had seen children beaten into silence before. He had seen children so frightened they wet themselves rather than make a sound. But this was different. These children were not afraid. They were empty. Nathaniel gestured toward the old Carriage house, a long, low building at the edge of the property that had once stored equipment but had been abandoned after the roof began to rot. In the past month, a crew of hired men, white men not slaves, had repaired it. New walls, new locks, new windows fitted with bars. Nathaniel had told people he was converting it into a storage house for cotton. But there was no cotton inside. Only beds, 41 of them arranged in rows like a barracks. The children were led inside single file. They did not stumble. They did not look around. They climbed into the beds they were assigned and lay down, hands at their sides, eyes open. Reverend Cormorant stood at the door and smiled. "They are very obedient," he said. Nathaniel nodded. "What's wrong with them?" "Nothing is wrong, Mr. Bellewood. They have simply been unburdened." "Unburdened? Of memory, of want, of will." The Reverend adjusted his spectacles. "They have been prepared for God's purpose. And in 6 months' time, when the renewal comes, they will serve it beautifully." Nathaniel did not ask what the renewal was. He had been paid $3,000 to house the children and ask no questions. That was enough. But Ezra, still watching, heard every word. And he understood that whatever had been done to these children was the same thing being done to Constance. The children did not cry. They did not play. They did not fight or laugh or ask for their mothers. Every morning at dawn, they rose from their beds in perfect unison. They dressed. They ate the porridge brought to them in wooden bowls. They sat in silence until the Reverend arrived to lead them in prayer. The prayer lasted 3 hours. It was not any prayer Ezra had ever heard. The words were in Latin or something close to it. The Reverend spoke them in a rhythm that sounded almost like singing, and the children repeated them, syllable for syllable, their voices flat and soft as dust. Afterward they were given tasks: washing stones, folding cloth, stacking wooden blocks and then unstacking them. Work that produced nothing, work designed only to fill time. Ezra began to bring them water. It was not his job, but he volunteered, and Nathaniel, always eager to avoid paying for additional labor, allowed it. The first time Ezra entered the Carriage house, he crouched beside a small girl, no more than 6, with hair the color of wheat stubble. "What's your name?" he asked. She stared at him. "Do you remember your mama?" Nothing. He tried again with a boy of 9, then a girl of 12. Every response was the same. silence and eyes that looked through him as if he were glass. But on the fourth day, one of the older boys blinked. It was brief. A flicker of recognition, maybe confusion, as if he had just woken from a dream and didn't know where he was. Ezra leaned closer. "Can you hear me?" The boy's mouth opened. His lips moved. No sound came out, but Ezra saw the shape of the word. Help. That night, Ezra went to the attic. He had never been inside, but he knew where the key was kept, hanging on a nail in Nathaniel's study beneath a painting of a hunting dog. He waited until the house was dark. He took the key. He climbed the stairs. The door opened without a sound. Inside, the room was smaller than he'd expected. A bed, a chair, a chamber pot. The walls were covered in scratches, words, symbols, prayers carved into the wood with something sharp. Constance sat on the bed, her knees drawn to her chest. She looked at him. "You're the one who brings the firewood," she said. Her voice was hoarse but clear. Ezra nodded. "Yes, miss." "Are you here to hurt me?" "No." She studied him for a long moment. Then slowly she unfolded her legs and stood. She was thin, too thin, but her eyes were sharp. "Then why are you here?" "The children," Ezra said. "In the Carriage house, something's been done to them." Constance's expression did not change, but her hands, which had been resting at her sides, curled into fists. "Dr. Grier," she said. "You know him. He comes to see me twice a month. He brings medicine. He says it will cure me." She paused. "But it doesn't cure, it erases." "Erases what?" "Memory, desire." Self, she crossed to the window, though it was too dark to see anything outside. "The first time I fought, I screamed. I broke a mirror and tried to cut him." "What did he do?" "He gave me more. And when I woke, I couldn't remember my mother's face." Her voice cracked. "I still can't." Ezra's chest tightened. "The children are like me, only worse. They've been given the formula since they were brought to the orphanage. Months of it, maybe years. By now, there's almost nothing left." "Why?" Constance turned. "Because the Ordo Renovo believes that the soul is corrupted by memory, that to be pure you must be blank. And once you are blank," she smiled, bitter and sharp, "you can be written on." "Written on with what?" "I don't know, but the Reverend comes every week, and every week he takes one of the children into the back room. And when they come out, they're different." "Different how?" "They know things they shouldn't, languages, verses, names of dead men." She met his eyes. "It's like someone else is inside them." Ezra began to watch. He watched the Reverend lead a boy of 11 into the back room of the Carriage house and emerge 30 minutes later, the boy walking behind him with his head tilted at an odd angle, his lips moving in silence. He watched Dr. Grier arrive with his black leather case and disappear into the attic, and heard, hours later, Constance's muffled sobbing. He watched Nathaniel Bellewood drink bourbon on the porch every evening, staring out at fields he could no longer afford to work, pretending not to hear. And he watched the children. One night he hid in the shadows outside the Carriage house and peered through the barred window. Inside, the children sat in a circle. The Reverend stood at the center, his arms raised, speaking in that strange, rhythmic language. And the children answered. But this time their voices were not flat, they were layered, as if a dozen voices were speaking from each small throat, some high, some low, some in languages Ezra did not recognize. The Reverend smiled. "Good," he said. "The vessels are nearly ready." One of the children, a girl of 8 with a birthmark on her cheek, turned her head and looked directly at the window, directly at Ezra. And in a voice far too old for her body, she said, "He sees us." The Reverend's head snapped toward the window. Ezra ran. He found Constance awake, pacing her small room like a caged animal. "They know I was there," he said, breathless. "Of course they do. The ones inside, the children, they see everything now." "The ones inside, what are you talking about?" Constance stopped. "The Ordo Renovo doesn't just erase the children, they replace them. They summon the dead, men who were scholars, priests, philosophers, and bind them into the children's bodies." Ezra stared. "That ain't possible." "I've seen the books. Grier leaves them sometimes. Rituals, invocations. The Order believes that the world is fallen, and the only way to redeem it is to bring back the pure souls of the past. But souls need bodies, and the easiest bodies to take are the ones that have been emptied. So those children aren't children anymore." Ezra sank onto the floor. Why would anyone do this? Because they believe they're saving the world, and because no one is stopping them. We could tell someone. Who? Constance's laugh was raw. My father's being paid, the church sanctions it. The law won't listen to a slave or a madwoman. Then what do we do? Constance knelt in front of him. For the first time in 7 years, her eyes held something other than despair. We burn it down. They began with the medicine. Constance had been saving her doses of Dr. Grier's formula for months, spitting them into a rag and hiding them beneath the floorboards. She had nearly a pint. Ezra took it. He didn't know if it could be reversed, but he knew plants. He knew that most poisons could be countered if caught early enough. He began by diluting the children's porridge with water infused with activated charcoal and milk thistle, anything that might flush the formula from their systems. It took 3 weeks, but slowly the children began to change. A girl of 7 started crying in her sleep. A boy of 10 asked for his mother. A girl of 12 looked at Ezra and said in her own small voice, "Where am I?" The Reverend noticed. On the night of November 30th, he arrived with 6 men Ezra had never seen before. They wore the same dark coats, the same green-lensed spectacles. They entered the carriage house and began examining the children one by one, speaking in low, sharp tones. Then the Reverend walked out and went directly to Nathaniel Bellewood's study. Ezra, hiding near the window, heard every word. "Your man has been interfering." "What man's?" "The Negro, Ezra. He's been poisoning the vessels." Nathaniel went silent. "Then I'll deal with it." "You will do more than deal with it. The renewal is in 3 days. If the vessels are not ready, the consecration will fail. And if it fails, Mr. Bellewood, your debt to the order will come due in ways you cannot pay." Nathaniel's voice shook. "What do you want me to do?" "Bind him, gag him, and on the night of the renewal he will serve as the first offering." They came for Ezra an hour before dawn. Tobias Rudge and 2 other men dragged him from his cabin, bound his wrists with rope, and locked him in the root cellar beneath the kitchen house. He had expected it. What he had not expected was Constance. She came in the darkest part of the night, a candle in one hand and a knife in the other. "How did you?" "I broke the lock," she sawed through the ropes. "My father thinks I'm too weak to lift a chair. He's wrong." "They'll kill you." "They were always going to kill me, one way or another." She pulled him to his feet. "The renewal happens tonight, midnight. They're going to try to complete the ritual, all 41 children filled with the dead, and then sacrificed to purify the land." That's what Grier told me. He thought I was too far gone to remember. "We can't stop them alone." "We're not alone." She led him to the carriage house. Inside, the children were awake, and for the first time they were aware, frightened, confused, angry, but aware. "They remember enough now," Constance said, "enough to know what was done to them." One of the older boys looked up at Ezra. "Will you help us?" Ezra crouched down. "Yes, but you have to trust me." The boy nodded. "What do we do?" "We take back what's ours." At midnight, the Reverend and his 6 brothers of the Ordo Renovo gathered in the clearing behind the carriage house. They had drawn a circle in salt and ash. They had placed candles at each cardinal point. They had prepared the incantation, written on parchment made from the skin of a stillborn calf. They expected to find the children waiting in their beds, docile and ready. Instead, they found the carriage house empty. And then they smelled smoke. The fields were burning. Ezra and Constance had soaked the cotton in lamp oil and set it alight at 4 corners. The fire spread fast, driven by the wind off the marsh. The Reverend screamed for his men to save the ritual space, but the flames moved faster, and from the shadows of the tree line the children emerged, not empty, not silent. 41 small faces lit by fire, holding stones and sticks and broken glass. They did not speak. They simply walked forward. The Reverend raised his hands and began the incantation, trying to summon the dead back into the vessels, trying to reestablish control. But the words had no power, because the children were no longer empty. They were full of rage, of memory, of the will to survive. The first stone hit the Reverend in the chest. The second shattered his spectacles. By the time Nathaniel Bellewood arrived, drawn by the flames, the men of the Ordo Renovo were on the ground and the children were standing over them. Constance stepped into the firelight. Her father stared. "Constance." "No," she said. "You don't get to say my name." Nathaniel reached for her. She drove the knife into his hand. He howled, stumbling backward, and Ezra caught him by the collar. "You sold us," Ezra said quietly. "All of us. And you thought you'd never have to pay." He let go. Nathaniel fell to his knees. Constance looked down at him. Then she turned and walked toward the children. "Come on," she said. "We're leaving." The fire burned for 2 days. By the time it was done, Bellewood Plantation was ash and bone. The main house collapsed. The fields were scorched black. The carriage house and everything inside it was gone. Nathaniel Bellewood's body was found in the ruins of the study, a pistol in his hand. They said he'd shot himself rather than face bankruptcy. Constance Bellewood was never seen again. The children vanished. Some said they walked to Charleston and were taken in by the church. Others said they disappeared into the marshes and were raised by runaway slaves and Seminole traders. No one looked too hard, because no one wanted to ask what had really happened. The Ordo Renovo dissolved. Reverend Cormorant's body was found in the clearing, his skull caved in by a rock small enough to fit in a child's hand. Dr. Amos Grier fled to New Orleans. 6 months later, he was found in his rented room, dead of what the coroner called spontaneous hemorrhage of the brain. His eyes were missing. Ezra disappeared the same night as Constance and the children. Some say he went north, using the skills his mother taught him to become a healer in free territories. Others say he stayed in the low country, moving from plantation to plantation, a ghost in the quarters, teaching people what he knew, teaching them how to resist. In 1843, a schoolteacher in Charleston reported that she had taken in a young woman and several children who claimed to have no memory of where they'd come from. The young woman said her name was Constance and that she wanted to learn to read. The teacher wrote to the authorities. By the time they arrived, the house was empty. But in the attic, carved into the wall in careful letters, was a single sentence. "We remember now, and we will not be erased." Decades later, when the land where Bellewood Plantation had stood was surveyed for timber, the workers found something beneath the remains of the carriage house. A room, underground, lined with shelves. On those shelves were glass jars, 41 of them, each labeled with a name and a date. Inside each jar was a human tongue, preserved in formaldehyde, cut from the mouths of children so they could never speak the names of the men who had stolen their minds. The workers reburied the room. No one spoke of it again. But in the years that followed, people who walked the land at night reported hearing voices. Children's voices, singing, not in sorrow, in triumph. There are atrocities that history forgets because no one wants to remember. And there are atrocities that history forgets because the people who committed them had the power to burn the records. The Ordo Renovo is not in your textbooks. Black Hollow Foundling Home does not appear on any map. But the scars are real. The jars were real. And the children, 41 souls who were hollowed out and filled with the dead, who were used as vessels for a secret society's vision of purity, those children were real. Some of them survived. Some of them found Constance and Ezra. Some of them learned to remember. And in remembering, they became something the Order never anticipated, witnesses. So here's the question I'll leave you with. How many other rooms are buried beneath the soil of this country? How many other shelves hold jars we'll never open? And how many other children are still waiting for someone to hear them sing? If this story stayed with you, subscribe. Hit the bell and tell me in the comments if you had been there, if you had seen the carts arrive.